Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. And today, I'm finally talking about week 1 of February Fantasy Stories, which was last week. February Fantasy Stories, which is an event that was created by the Bookish Bryants over at their channel, and a bunch of different channels are participating in this, where every week we read a different short fantasy novel or short fantasy story or a collection of stories. Every week has a different theme, and week 1 was classic fantasy, which apparently is everything fantasy related that was published before 1971. So if it predates me, it's classic. Afterwards, it's modern. I guess that's how it works. Anyway, yeah, so week 1 was classic fantasy. And so I'm going to talk about what I read in the first week. Well, I'm going to talk about one of the books I read in the first week. And the first week I read this book, Ciel Moore's Jirel of Joiry. This is classic fantasy. It's not the only book I read this past week, the first week. I also read this book, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, but I'm going to be talking about this one on Sunday for the Sunday Penguin because this is Sunday. This is Penguin. Penguin published this. This is a Penguin Deluxe Classic. Also, it doesn't really count as classic fantasy because it was published in the late 70s. But you know, the plots, these are basically retellings of classic fairy tales. So the plots are very, very old. So I guess if you stretch to point, but not really. But it is fantasy, so, you know, I'll talk about it on Sunday. It was a good book. But right now we're talking about this. Ciel Moore's Jirel of Joiry, and this was a really interesting book. I'm surprised at myself that it's taken me so long to get to this. I've been aware of these stories forever. These are well-known stories in the weird fiction, fantasy fiction genre. These were written by Ciel Moore, and they were published in Weird Tales, along with the stories of H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith. Ciel Moore was born January 24th, 1911. She passed away April 4th, 1984. Her full name was Catherine Lucille Moore. And this book, the stories that comprise this book, there are 5 stories in this book. Yes, there are 5 stories in this book. See, I remember things sometimes, and I can count up to 5. I know, that's pretty surprising. But yeah, there are 5 stories in this book. They were published in Weird Tales. The first one was Black God's Kiss, which was published in Weird Tales. It got the cover spot. I have to say, Jirel of Joiry is a lot tougher than she looks on that cover. But that's how they did it in Weird Tales. This cover is a little bit better for Jerrell, because Jerrell is really, really tough, this girl. A woman warrior, written in a time when there were no women warriors, really. These stories were published 1934 through 1939. Only 5 of them, apparently. Ciel Moore married science fiction writer Henry Kuttner, a good writer, in 1940. And after 1940, until Kuttner died in 1958, they collaborated pretty much on everything, whether it had Moore's name on it or Kuttner's name on it. They generally did their work together. And it was good stuff. But this book was before all that. This was just her writing on her own. And it's dynamite. It's dynamite stuff. The Northwest Smith books up to this point, or Northwest Smith stories up to this point, were my favorites from her. About outer space, Western tough guy, Northwest Smith, who was kind of a shady character. He was kind of, you know, Han Solo decades before Han Solo showed up, but without the sense of humor, really. I liked the Northwest Smith stories, even though all of them had kind of a sameness to them. Northwest Smith was always battling some ghastly alien who wanted to suck off his life force or his intelligence or something. And he had to battle for his soul or his identity or his life or all three. They're great stories. I think I like these better, though. Jerrell, who is the Lady of Jory, she's kind of a warlord in a time of warlords. All the lords around her, they all had their own castles, they all had their own soldiers, and she was no different. And like a lot of tougher warlords, she, back in these days, in the Middle Ages, would fight at the head of her warriors. She was super tough, this one. Always going into battle in full armor. She was super cool. And so they are sword and sorcery stories, but they're really weird ones. I like the imagination in these stories. Jirel of Joiry, her castle, just happens to be above a pit that leads to another dimension. Just happens to be. It's kind of hell. It's like hell. That's where the Black God rules. In this pit that leads to another dimension, this other dimension that she could access through her castle. It's never explained, really, why it's there. She talks a little bit how her and the priest of the castle discovered it and made a journey part way down it, I suppose. I can't really remember how far she went, but they didn't get too far the first time. But why it's there? You know, sometimes you just happen to get some real estate and there's another dimension underneath you. Sometimes you got to be careful. And that happened to Jirel of Joiry. And so she visited this other dimension a couple times in this book. The first time to find some kind of terrible weapon which she can use against an enemy that she actually kind of liked, actually. So the scene where she goes down in Black God's Kiss, which was probably my favorite story out of the bunch. There were some good stories in this. They were all pretty good, actually. Black God's Kiss is probably the best, just for the sheer weird imagery of this other dimension. Excuse the beeping. I think that's my alarm. Anyway, she travels down to this other dimension, and it is some of the weirdest stuff you'll read. In fact, the cover blurb for Weird Tales, where this was first published, says, "The weirdest story ever told," I think it says. That is not true, but it was pretty weird. And just her journey in this creepy, creepy place was fantastic. In the second story, she returns to this dimension and has further and even creepier adventures. Those are the first two stories. Jerrell Meets Magic is the third story, and once again, Jerrell goes to another dimension, but this is a different other dimension she goes to. She's following a wizard who left his trail to this other dimension. It's really weird. But she's after this dastardly wizard who had killed some of her men, and she vows to kill him because she's super tough. And when she's after you, man, nothing's going to stop her. So she goes into this other dimension trailing this wizard. And it's basically about her hunting this guy and what she encounters, which is serious weirdness. It's another really strange other dimension. Then we have the Dark Land, another great story, and Hell's Guard. The Dark Land was super weird. Again, goes to another dimension because the god of this dimension, who has created this dimension, wants to marry her. Because she's Jirel of Joiry. Who wouldn't want to marry her, I guess? And so he steals her away. And the story is about basically her trying to escape. And it has the White Witch in that story, which is one of the creepiest characters in this whole book. The White Witch could be one of the creepiest characters I've ever come across in a story that was published in Weird Tales. It was she did a great job on that character. And again, the imagery is fantastic. Her imagination was really good in this. So even though she's always going to other dimensions, this one, they're always really interesting and really entertaining. The last story is a little different. Hell's Guard, which is basically kind of a haunted castle story or a haunted house story. Again, with super creepy characters in it, though. It's basically, there's a ghost in this, and it's a super gross, creepy ghost. But again, it's a fantasy story, but kind of a haunted house story at the same time. So, like Northwest Smith, she encounters kind of the same kind of thing. But they're all different enough to make them interesting. And I think just the writing and the character and the stuff that she encounters kind of puts this above Northwest Smith in my mind, although that was a pretty darn good book. But this could be the best. What I think is her best is probably this. True, after she starts writing with Kuttner, it's kind of hard to tell what's her stuff and what's Kuttner's stuff because they collaborated. But this is all Ciel Moore. So you can see just how much talent she had on her own. And she had a lot. This is a great book. I highly recommend it. Jirel of Joiry. You can get it on the Kindle. Pretty cheap and pretty easy. So it's very accessible to everybody. And so, it was awesome. A good first week for February fantasy stories. And again, I also read this, and I will talk about this on Sunday. And what am I reading this week? I left it over there. Hold on. I have returned. Did you miss me? Of course you did. Who wouldn't? So anyway, this week actually is Sword and Sorcery Week. The week that's happening now. And I'm reading this. This is Swords Against Darkness. I have not had much time to read this week, unfortunately, unlike last week. I was hoping to read 2 books this week. I wanted to read this one, Swords Against Darkness, and David Wiley's Monster Huntress. David Wiley, who of course has a BookTube channel here, and he wrote Monster Huntress. So I like the stories I've read about Monster Huntress in the past. I've read some in his short story collection. A Merchant in Oria, I think it was called. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. But it had Monster Huntress stories in that. And so I wanted to read this one. And I was going to read it as an ebook, but I probably won't have time because, like I said, I don't have much time to read this week. And I'm not even halfway through this. It's that kind of week, man. But it's kind of good because it gave me a chance to buy the paperback. Apparently it's in paperback now, Monster Huntress. So I just bought the paperback. So I'll read it when it gets in. I wanted a paperback of it. Physical copy of David's book. So that's this week. And next week is Dark Fantasy. So next week it'll be Cain, Carl Edward Wagner's Cain, Death Angel's Shadow. This is a pretty short book, so I should be able to, I'm hoping I have more time next week, and be able to squeeze something else in for next week. But we'll see. But anyway, February Fantasy Stories Week 1, Jirel of Joiry. Yeah, that's all I have to say this week. Catch me tomorrow. Hopefully I'll be back tomorrow, hopefully. And I will see you then.